Hi, everybody. Welcome to Health and the Family, week number 12, which I believe is our concluding lecture video for this course. I received some feedback from many of you in the course and feedback from students in other courses as well. And based on that feedback, I thought that the best way forward for this week, as our way of ending the course, is to provide you with a brief overview of all of the material that we've covered, a sort of broad overview that tries to touch the most pressing and most important topics to sort of give you a sense of what we've developed together in this particular course, in this particular semester. I think it could help us to understand its relevance, of the important and perhaps even provocative moves that we've made in this course, and to understand in a new way ideas that may have previously been obscure, and also to go the other direction too, to make ideas that maybe you believe you finally understand, to make them a bit more obscure too. That's my hope for today anyway, so I'm going to begin there. When I think back to week number 1, I opened the course, as I did many of my courses, I think all of my courses this time, and in a slightly different way, but basically what I did was I opened every course with some sort of an anecdote relating to our current situation, that is the situation of the pandemic, the situation of COVID-19, for understanding what might be implied in the development of a new paradigm within the sociology of health. I made the case that the problems that we suffer from during COVID-19 have everything to do with our social proximity, how close we are to one another, or if you like, our social integration, how integrated we are as a society, how close our interaction and how dramatic our interactions are with one another. The problem is that we're too close to one another. The solution, we understand, in a pandemic is to implement more distance. You know, the pandemic spreads, of course, from proximity, but so many other negative health effects stem from over proximity as well. So, for example, when we're too close, we might spread the virus, or when we're too close, we might feel anxious because, I don't know, maybe we need some peace and we need some quiet, a room of our own, perhaps to focus on our schoolwork. Or whatever else, our personal relationships. If we're living with our families and we have a partner living somewhere else, we need some space from our family. So I realized that distance also feels like a problem. I just don't think it's as significant as a problem. It seems more to be our solution right now. Because, you know, I know that many of us feel too far from our partners. For example, we hear stories about people separated from their children at the beginning of the pandemic, and maybe even still. I mean, I myself was telling that story on the news from Mumbai. I was separated from everybody I knew, stuck in a tiny little apartment in Mumbai, away from my son, who was living in Alberta at the time. The distance is perhaps just as extreme for some of us as the proximity. There's something about this concept, distance, proximity, integration, that seems important for understanding the sociology of health. Yet I also noted that the concept of time is important. If distance and proximity have something to do with space, where we are situated spatially, how we are situated as social creatures within space, or how we interact and form or have social relationships in space, then there's also this dimension of time that we need to take into account. What does it mean to lose our sense of time, for example? In the pandemic, we seem to have more issues having to do with time and the feeling of timelessness. Time becomes very obviously quite liquid for each one of us as we experience time. And we all experience time perhaps quite differently, but on the whole, our social experience of time seems to have changed. Time seems to become liquid. This is how I put it in the very first class anyway. Everything seems to happen all at once. There's a simultaneity to it. Whereas our old notions of time were sequential, discrete and sequential. We moved from before to now to future and so on. It was sequential, one after another. Time is simultaneous, more and more simultaneous in the pandemic. And the pandemic is just it makes what was already happening in contemporary society much more obvious and explicit. So it's as if there is no time. I gave some concrete examples, of course, like checking your email and responding to work assignments in the middle of the night, as I often do. I deliver lectures at any time of the day. I've produced some lectures a week in advance, some right on time, some in the middle of the night, some in the very early hours of the morning, and so on. It doesn't quite matter when I do it. There's a timelessness there. Time is not regulated or anchored in the way that it was several decades ago. My experience of time anyway. So I work on it whenever I get the chance, just like many of you are working on your school assignments whenever you get the chance, and dealing with all of the other various duties that you have that seem to all be hitting you at around the same time. Some of you try and make schedules so that you can deal with it, but you make the schedule, right? You're the one making your work schedule and plotting it and so on. It didn't used to be that way. This would lead us to a discussion on the problems of time management later in the course. There are cases of people sleeping at odd hours, waking up at odd hours during the first few months of the pandemic. All of this has something to do with a movement in our experience of our social experience of time. You know, there were even discussions of the movement from that of discrete time, discrete and sequential time, where we thought of time in terms of a sequence. Minimally, time was composed of a before, a now, and an after, or a future, which is how we intuitively used to think about time anyway. But we lost this for a while with the pandemic. Many people reported forgetting, as I did. I forgot, and I still forget. Come to think of it, Facebook reminded me, thankfully, yesterday. But I forgot when the pandemic began. I don't remember when it began. I don't know of the before anymore. Not knowing if it will ever end. More and more people were having nightmares that they were sucked into this timeless space where it feels like the pandemic's never going to end. Plunged into the nightmare of the now. Time became not only liquid, but also infinite. And I discussed this notion of the loss of time and the loss of space, of the liquidity of time and space, of the new relationships or experiences, social experiences of time and space, or timelessness and spacelessness in psychoanalytic language. It's the feeling of being swallowed up. We are swallowed up by our small and compact spaces, or the intense social interactions that are now happening, that now seem to exist because of social media. We feel swallowed up by time itself, lost amidst the darkness and the chaos of the pandemic. Our relationships, our social relationships, and even our subjective relationships to time and space have changed. It's signaled by the pandemic, but it pre-existed the pandemic. And it signals that there's something important about understanding social health according to our relationships in and to time and space. This was the major point that I made in the first class, which was, it was a really short first class, but it was loaded with all of the material that I didn't know we would end up developing in our own way later with more conceptual clarity in the course. So we discussed here social relationships in space and time, but also relatedly, social relationships which are situated in space and time between the family and the workplace, the relationship of the family and the workplace, which is not immune to the effects of space and time. We opened up the question of the loss of the distinction between family and work. put simply, across space and time dimensions. Like, for example, the old distinction that separated the family from the workplace, spatially separated the family from the workplace. They were located in two different places, to put it very simply. The family was, let's say, in the home, and the workplace was outside of the home in some building somewhere, probably downtown or in a factory, I don't know, but it was in another place. So they're at some distance from one another, the work life and the family, spatially at some distance. And there was the old distinction that separated family and the workplace in time as well. Not only were they at some spatial distance from one another, but they regulated time differently. Like, each required different moments, different time commitments. The workplace would require you to be there spatially from 9 to 5, and then you could go home and you'd have weekends at home. So your time was kind of managed in that way. And I gave the example of how in the most contemporary period, where the pandemic wakes us up to what has been going on in the last few decades, to our social relationships in space and time, and therefore consequently our health, our social health. I gave the example of how late night talk show hosts who are working now from home and have been for quite some time, some of them are returning to the studio, but in a different way. They were initially Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, Colbert, I can think of all kinds of them. They were initially incorporating their children and their family into the show. They became part of the show. They were kind of an incidental part of the show. For Jimmy Fallon, the children were always kind of in front of the camera. That's the work-family balance on full display, the work-family imbalance on full display. This was what the author of one of the chapters in her textbook called spillover, which I thought was an important concept, because there's here an example of the spillover of the workplace into the family, into the home, for example, into the family, and the family into the workplace spills over as well. It spills over in both directions. The family spills over also, as we now know from the pandemic, into the workplace. We see our professors' homes now, for example. You can see my home. My home is there in the workplace, and you are here in my home. So there's the concept of spillover seems to help us understand what's kind of been happening in the last few decades. And at this point, I think we began to open up the question of health. What is it, sociologically speaking, as a concept? How can we conceptualize health? How can we think about health sociologically? There's a taken for granted psychological and physiological or biological or medical conception of health that we still seem to transport into the sociological literature, vernacular. It's like we, even when we're talking about social determinants of health, we often talk about how society produces biological, physiological, medical, psychological, and so on, health outcomes. But we rarely discuss health outcomes as social, in terms of social health, not biological, not psychological. So I asked, is it possible to talk about a sociological conception of health? I merely opened this question up in the first class or two, and I left it hanging. I didn't know I would eventually try and answer it. I'm surprised, as probably you are, as I move through each one of my classes, because each of my classes are singular inventions. And we always invent something a little bit different. I never repeat the same class, even where it appears that I do. So we ended up at some point addressing this, which is interesting. In the second class, I situated within the sociological conception that we've been laying out, which focuses on the loss of time and space. I focused on a zone of death. I mean death in a sociological sense, again, and not only or exclusively in a biological or psychological sense. There's a terrible, it's It's perhaps quite terrible, but sometimes you'll hear people say, well, he's physically dead. He can't move his body, but he still has his mind, or he's mentally dead. And you hear these, I mean, it's not a very nice thing to say, and it's not accurate, but you hear that. But what about talking about not biological death, not psychological death, but sociological death? What is sociological death? There is a notion of death to social relationships or to the social bond that we can call, I've been calling it, the place of nightmares. I like this, actually, calling, relating death sociologically to something of a nightmare. I pointed at the work of Emil Durkheim and Zygmunt Bauman. If you remember Bauman, B-A-U-M-A-N. And I demonstrated through Durkheim and Bauman that there is a precedent for thinking in sociology about death in a sociological way. There's a precedent within the sociological literature for this, although we tend not to highlight it. For example, death need not be only understood biologically. We can also think about social death, which has to do with the loss of the integrity of social relationships in space-time. The nightmare of social life is precisely the death of our social interactions in space and time, or their overwhelming presence. Either extremes are just as bad, of course. When you're like the main character in Castaway, if you've seen that movie, completely alone on an island for a very long time, that's maddening. That's a nightmare. But it's just as much of a nightmare to be sitting in a room and have endless people around you making demands upon you. To be too social is just as bad as to be not social. So I link those two things. The nightmare of social life then is precisely the death of our social interactions in space and time, or else the over proximity of them. But there's another aspect to this, and I realize that at this point in the course we tend to get quite obscure, but that's how it goes in my classes. But it's a really important point. It's a subtle point, so I hope you can try and get it. Death, social death, is also the impetus, the engine, the motivation for the establishment, maintenance, and renewal of social bonds in space-time. So, for example, so death is a bad. Let's put it really simply. Death is a bad thing. Yes, it's the end to our social relationships. It's too much, but it's also because of death that we form social relationships with one another. It's the engine of sociability. So, for example, Durkheim gave the example, which I provided you in the second or the third class, that at a funeral, what we witness happening at a funeral, where you literally have a death of a human being, we see that the funeral functions as a social institution. We can call it a life strategy if we want to borrow the concept from Zygmunt Bauman, to reignite social bonds, to renew them, to reinvigorate them or invigorate them around the nightmare of the loss of the social body. You know, at the moment when somebody is dead, all of a sudden people start to hug each other, and they reform social bonds. They form bonds around the death, which is something we see in I think almost every culture and society around the world in different ways. And this is what Emil Durkheim was pointing at. It's really quite genius, I think. The nightmare of death pushes us. It compels us socially in the world. And it's for this reason that Zygmunt Bauman claims that all social institutions, and not just funerals or religious institutions or whatever, they can all be understood as what he called life strategies. That is, ways of avoiding death, ways that consequences of the push of death in the social. Death pushes us to be social, in a word. So I tried to show you at this point that the work of Sigmund Freud I don't want to shock anybody. You're going to see my knee. I'm wearing shorts. It's sunny today. Um, okay. I tried to show you that the work of Sigmund Freud, which in my educated opinion is sociological just as much as it's psychoanalytical, and the work of Jacques Lacan, Lacan, if you remember, helps us to think about the social utility of death. Language itself, as a social fact, to put it in Durkheim's words, is always a way of representing or dealing with death in our waking life. I put this in an interesting way, paraphrasing the work of the psychoanalytic sociologist who's a Freudian, who's a Lacanian, who's a sociologist, Slavoj Zizek, Zizek. I paraphrased something he wrote and I twisted it for our purposes. And I said to you that we feel healthy in society because we lack the language to articulate our reliance upon the nightmare of death, of sickness, that endlessly invades our social bonds, gives rise to them, and paradoxically sustains them even while threatening them. We feel healthy because we haven't yet, because we've been avoiding, because we haven't yet been able to confront and articulate our reliance and dependence upon death. At this point, what I did was I discussed five really sociological, theoretical perspectives that inform the work that we have been doing in this course, which included, I'm not going to haul up a whiteboard, and I apologize that today's video is a little less dynamic, but it was symbolic interactionism, ecological or systems theory, life course perspectives, conflict theory, and of course the broader one that I've been focusing the most on, which incorporates all of these in a way, psychoanalytic or psychoanalytic sociology. And my claim is that the fifth position, psychoanalytic sociology, integrates all of the essential truths of the preceding ones, but adds to them the centrality of death for the renewal and invigoration of social relationships. Symbolic interactionism helps us think about social relationships, interactions, roles, gestures, meaning, and so on. Ecological system theories help us to think across any scale of analysis and not just the micrological, as we tend to see in symbolic interactionist perspectives. Life course perspectives highlight the changing nature of time and put time at the center of the analysis, the centrality of time. And conflict perspectives keep us on our toes because they force us to ask who benefits and who suffers through particular life strategies, and why some people have to suffer as a consequence of these life strategies that societies or social institutions make. The third lecture, and I'm going to move through the rest of them fairly quickly now because I realize I've been spending too much time on each lecture. The third lecture focused on Freud, and it tried to show the place of the child in the family. I demonstrated that there is a separation and alienation of the child, whereby alienation refers to the child's loss of space and time, and separation means that there's some distance and some time for the child. This is how the child gets autonomy, not through alienation, but through separation. And we also in this class opened up the problem of contemporary sociological discussions of the work-family balance as a health concern, because it does not address the overarching context and historical changes that have existed and that have given rise to the very problem. This is a historically novel issue, I would say. The work-family balance is a historically novel issue because it didn't even become a concern in sociological literature. It wasn't even something we talked about in the world of management or business or sociology or anthropology or even on mainstream news, or even just anecdotally, for each one of us, we never used to talk about the work-family balance all that much. It wasn't popular as a concern until our most recent history, and we need to ask ourselves why. Why suddenly, at a particular historical moment, do we start to care about the work-family balance? And I tried to pick this up in the fourth lecture, and I arranged our discussion in terms of what I was calling the contemporary family. I discussed timelessness as a family trauma. And I looked at statistics, demographics, all kinds of charts and stuff like that to demonstrate that gender is one quite important variable in understanding the change of the family-work relationship historically from one that passed, whereas the preceding one was included an externally regulated division of labor, separated according to gender. So, the externally regulated division of labor means that if you were, to put it fairly, like very simply, if you were a man, this was the breadwinner model, you would enter the workforce, and the woman and the family would stay in the private sphere, and this is how the separation was performed and the life strategy was achieved, to the great benefit of one half of that gender division and the great disadvantage of another half, perhaps we might say. But it was externally regulated because the society imposed that cut, that form of separation. And we moved from that to what we might call an internally regulated division of labor, where gender is less of a variable in separating the private and the public sphere, the family and work. Since women entered the labor market roughly after World War II in significant numbers. All of a sudden, we can talk about things at this time. We can talk about things like clustered work schedules, time allocation issues, time management issues, multitasking, childcare issues, and so on, because the old separation in space and time no longer exists in the same way. I called this change a traumatic timelessness that exists in our present historical moment. And at this point, if you're getting tired, you can take a break now for maybe 5-10 minutes if you like. I mean, if you need me to tell you to, otherwise maybe you're regulating that for yourself. But at this point, I felt compelled to develop an argument for the sociological definition of health. We don't want to only have a sociological analysis of biological and psychological health. We want sociology to have its own social definition of health. So social health being something that's not reducible to biological or psychological health, has everything to do with the integrity of our social relationships in space-time. And to demonstrate this, I return to the classical work of Emil Durkheim again, who, for a very long time was known for his analysis of suicide as a purely sociological phenomenon and not a psychological or biological one. Suicide for him was not necessarily about biological or psychological death, but about a certain type of nightmare that exists within various societies or social groups, which are either too regulated or too integrated, or else not integrated enough or not regulated enough. That for Durkheim, there were these four possibilities. And I argued that it's a really good beginning for thinking about social health in this way, and not just suicide, and that we should continue to think about that as we move forward. Health itself as being an outcome of integration and regulation. In lecture number 6, I gave a number of contemporary examples of timeless and spaceless culture or societies. A society that loses, for example, its regulatory function, the function of regulation. The regulatory function, which once again we took from Durkheim, helped to separate individuals in space and time, often by a division of labor using gender as its principal variable, and to the great disadvantage of women, in order to erect a life strategy to support others in space and time. The literature seems pretty obvious on this point that men benefited the most from this arrangement in terms of health. We can talk about areas where men were disadvantaged as well, but this would open up a much deeper discussion, because it is true that in some ways men were disadvantaged as well, but largely, socially speaking, the life strategy was in favor of men. And I provided what I think to be an important historical overview of this trajectory, invented with you together. Never thought of this before this course, but it wasn't entirely developed yet. I used this lecture, and lecture 6, lecture 7, I think, to demonstrate that all modes of stratification, you name them however you like, age, race, gender, social economic status, class, whatever, all of them could be seen as life strategies from a sociology of health perspective that assist some of a society's population against the nightmare of death, while being extremely disadvantageous to others. I tried to show a fairly abstract historical movement here that I stand by, developing my previous thoughts further, where in time, so I outlined 3 times, if you remember. In time 1, there was a patriarchal or a traditional gendered division of labor, and I mapped that for you. In time 2, there was more gendered differentiation in the labor force. It was a transformation occurring roughly around and after World War II in the Western context. And I mapped how this impacted the family and the child. In time 3, there was a liquidity, what I was referring to as liquid capitalism. And this had implications you could revisit in the map that I produced in that class. Another way to think about this, though, is to imagine time 2 as a bit of an explosion. Gender differentiation is an explosion. It's an outward movement from the private sphere to the public. Women enter the labor force. In the third period, gender becomes more and more challenged, and that's subject for another course. But basically speaking, the explosion in time 2 has to do with women entering the labor force. So people went outside. That's why it's an explosion. They left the private realm, let's say. Time 3 can be thought of as an implosion. And I like this way of putting it, that the public collapses into the private. Everybody stays at home. Not everybody, it's hyperbolic, not everybody, but mostly. We can talk about essential workers and so on, but a lot of people, the vast majority of people, are staying at home, and the public comes there. And I developed this, so explosion time 2, implosion time 3. I developed this in a really innovative way, and I hope you can really interrogate this model and think about it. And it would be wonderful if somebody could do something with it. It's a really nice invention, this conceptual invention of explosion and implosion. I went on to discuss, I'm going to come to the end now. I went on to discuss the place of the child and the child's health and care throughout these historical periods, time 1, 2, and 3. And I asked, what is the place of the child today? The child's health, the health of the child, and so on. We discussed all kinds of things at around this time in the course. We were talking about non-standard jobs, low-skilled jobs, bullshit jobs, ambiguous employment, scheduling instabilities, MIC jobs. Did I say the gig economy? I'm not sure. All of these things, and we could say a heck of a lot more. But as I began to wind down the course, I tried to convince you to be extremely critical of this concept that we take for granted within the sociology of health and within our society as such, not just in sociology. It's the word outcomes. I reminded you that we often hear about learning outcomes in the neoliberal university, in the contemporary university in America and Canada and European context. Outcomes, learning outcomes, health outcomes. We hear a lot about outcomes. You're going to notice this word more and more now that I've highlighted it, hopefully. Health outcomes. We hear this so much. All the sociology literature in the sociology of health seems to use it uncritically. I don't see, maybe there's some literature out there that I just haven't found because I wasn't necessarily looking for it, where people are really critiquing and trying to understand why we use this phrase health outcomes and what ideological or historical ideology it's serving. Outcomes, I claimed, is implicated in an American ideological project that aims to monetize health against the specter of death. It's almost like, I'm thinking spontaneously, capital, money, capitalism is our best defense against death. Well, there's some arguments to be made that it maybe is. I'm not suggesting it's not, but this is the ideology nonetheless. I tried to demonstrate that there's a new period here within this contemporary moment of loneliness in children, which is a serious health topic. And I tried to give you a sense of the contemporary American ideology that makes it a taken for granted perspective, that we think about health in terms of outcomes, in terms of quick fixes and so on, and that we think about enjoyment and its relationship to the loneliness of contemporary individuals, specifically children, of course. Enjoyment, I argued, is one of the new modes of suffering that has occurred in the last very few decades. And from this, I deduced, I think, a truly sociological account of health that concludes that individuals suffer, children suffer, individuals of a society suffer, but it's not them who are sick. The environment is sick. The social environment is sick. The social structure is sick. This is the real disease. And we as individuals with symptoms of various kinds, like loneliness, depression, whatever else, are merely courageously, through our symptoms, attempting to cure ourselves. It doesn't work, of course, but we're attempting to cure ourselves from a sick environment. Part of this sickness is a desire for balance, harmony, good health, stability, and so on. So the work-family balance, for example, is a contemporary ideology that conceals the sick environment, that forces us to try and balance the demands that our environment is now making upon us in time 3. This is where I decided to end the course. And as I ended, I realized we're still in it. We're still in the pandemic. And somehow you've made it through a semester. And a particularly difficult one with me, I know, because it's not the sort of course that you would expect, perhaps because of the unique sociological approach that I take and that I encourage all of you to take. But I do thank you all for moving along in this very interesting and inventive and innovative journey. It was really nice getting to know all of you. If any of you see me outside in the streets of North Bay, please say hi. It would be wonderful to talk to some of you. If any of you are struggling through the end of the term or semester, please don't hesitate to email me. I will try to respond to you and come out with some sort of a solution to help get you through as quickly as I can, although I am bombarded with emails now. I do tend to respond pretty quick. So yeah, it's been a pleasure. I wish I could have saw all of you, but maybe next semester or in the summer if any of you take my media course. All right, be well, everybody. Bye-bye.